I stared at the ceiling of my hospital room, counting the tiny holes in each acoustic tile to keep from screaming. The morphine drip attached to my arm wasn't nearly enough to dull this new pain. 3 cracked ribs, a shattered femur, and a concussion from the car crash were nothing compared to the knife Diana had just twisted in my heart. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The autumn sunlight filtered through the half-closed blinds, casting prison bar shadows across my blanket. My stepmother stood by the window, her silhouette haloed in golden light, as if the universe was playing some cruel joke, making her look angelic when she'd just revealed herself to be anything but. Nathan deserved better than the pittance your father left him, Diana continued, adjusting her Cartier watch. A gift from my father on their 5th anniversary. Blake has a future, real potential. That trust fund is his ticket to greatness, not your safety net for mediocrity. I swallowed hard, my throat dry from days of intubation after the accident. How much? I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Diana's lips curled into what might have been a smile on anyone else. To her, it was pure triumph. All of it, Alex. The whole $1.2 million. Transferred last week while you were still unconscious. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her cashmere sweater. The paperwork has already been processed. Your signature was arranged. My heart rate monitor betrayed me, beeping faster, as the implications hit. The money my mother had left before cancer took her when I was 16, the inheritance that was supposed to secure my future, my education, my chance at a life without debt, was gone. That's fraud, I said, surprised by how calm I sounded despite the storm raging inside me. Diana laughed, the sound like breaking glass. Prove it. Your father signed off on everything. Who do you think they'll believe? A respected community leader or his drug-addled stepchild? I've never touched drugs in my life, I said, still maintaining that eerie calm that seemed to be throwing her off balance. Details, she waved dismissively. One call to Dr. Reynolds about your concerning history of substance abuse, and few tears about how worried we've been. Well, you know how these things go. I did know. I'd watched Diana manipulate my father for 8 years, turning him against me with surgical precision until I was the family outsider, the problem child, who needed tough love rather than support. The child who'd once been the center of Thomas Mitchell's world was now just an afterthought, eclipsed by Diana's son Blake and her masterful emotional chess game. I closed my eyes, letting a single tear escape. Not because I was broken. No, that wasn't it at all. It was a relief. Diana had finally shown her true face, confirming what I'd suspected for years. The facade was gone. Thank you for letting me know, I said softly. Diana paused by the door, clearly thrown by my reaction. She'd expected screaming, threats, hysteria, the behaviors she'd carefully cultivated in our household by pushing me to the edge time and again. My calm acceptance didn't fit her script. You, what? She turned back, green eyes narrowing. I met her gaze steadily. I said thank you. To be honest, finally, for showing me exactly who you are. Something flickered across her face. Uncertainty, perhaps even a sliver of fear. Good. She should be afraid. Don't be dramatic, Alex. This is business, that's all. Blake needs a proper start in life. You're 24, already established with that little programming job. You don't need a handout. Established was a generous term for my entry-level position at a struggling tech startup. But I didn't correct her. Let her believe what she wanted. It would work to my advantage. You should focus on healing, Diana added, forcing her voice into a softer register, the concerned stepmother acting slipping back into place like a well-worn mask. Money is the least of your worries right now. As she turned to leave, her designer heels clicking against the linoleum floor, I felt a strange sense of clarity cut through the pain medication fog. For 8 years, I'd tried to make peace with. Diana tried to understand why she seemed to hate me on sight, tried to salvage some kind of relationship with my father who grew more distant with each passing year under her influence. I'd wasted so much energy trying to fix what couldn't be. The moment the door closed behind her, I reached for my phone on the bedside table, wincing as the movement pulled at my IV. With shaking fingers, I pulled up a contact I'd saved months ago but never called. Eleanor Blackwood, my mother's attorney. She finally did it, I texted. Exactly. Like you predicted. 3 dots appeared immediately then. I'm so sorry, Alex. Are you all right? I almost laughed at the question. All right? I was lying in a hospital bed, physically broken, financially ruined, and emotionally betrayed by what remained of my family. But strangely, I felt more focused than I had in years. No, I replied honestly. But I will be. Can you still access those contingency plans we discussed? Of course. Your mother was nothing if not thorough. I'll set everything in motion immediately. I set the phone down and leaned back against the pillows, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me. The afternoon sunlight had shifted, no longer illuminating the room with false warmth. Shadows lengthened across the floor, and for the first time in days, I welcomed the approaching darkness. My mother, Caroline Mitchell, had been many things: brilliant, kind, fiercely protective, but above all, she'd been perceptive. She'd seen through Diana Reynolds the moment my father brought her home, just 6 months after Mom's funeral. That woman is looking for a meal ticket, not a husband, she'd told me during one of our last lucid conversations before the cancer took her mind. Mom had known somehow that Diana would eventually come for the money she'd left me. The trust fund had been set up with specific conditions. I couldn't access the full amount until I turned 25, less than a year from now. But there was a provision for educational expenses and medical emergencies, administered through my father. Until I reached the designated age, a perfect target for someone patient enough to play the long game. And Diana Reynolds Mitchell had proven herself nothing if not patient. I closed my eyes, remembering the day she'd moved into our home. She'd arrived with her 12-year-old son Blake and a surprisingly modest amount of belongings for someone who claimed to come from old money. We travel light, she'd explained with a tinkling laugh that seemed to entrance my grief-stricken father. Blake had been sullen and withdrawn at first, which I'd attributed to the difficulty of adjusting to a new home, a new school, a new life. I'd gone out of my way to make him feel welcome, showing him around town, helping with homework, even giving up my larger bedroom when he complained about the size of the guest room. Looking back, I could see how Diana had encouraged my efforts, while simultaneously undermining them. "Isn't it sweet how Alex tries so hard?" she'd say to my father, making my genuine attempts at connection sound patronizing. "Blake's just used to a different standard of living, dear. He'll adjust to this." The slight pause before this somehow makes our comfortable upper-middle-class home sound like a hovel. The pattern continued for years. Everything I did was reframed through Diana's careful narrative. My academic achievements were showing off. My athletic accomplishments were desperate bids for attention. My quiet evenings reading were antisocial behavior. By the time I left for college, a state school rather than the Ivy League acceptances I'd received, because Diana had convinced my father that Alex needs to learn financial independence, the damage was done. My father looked at me with a stranger's eyes, seeing not his child but Diana's carefully constructed fiction. I shifted in the uncomfortable hospital bed, trying to find a position that didn't send pain shooting through my broken body. The car accident had been no one's fault, but the drunk driver who ran the red light, T-boning my sedan as I drove home from a late night at the office. But I couldn't help wondering if Diana saw it as an opportunity, rather than a tragedy. 3. Days unconscious in the ICU would have given her plenty of time to execute whatever plan she'd been formulating. My father, distraught and distracted by my condition, would have been easy to manipulate. A few documents slipped in among hospital paperwork, a practiced forgery of my signature, and 8 years of poisoning my father against me. It was the perfect storm. The nurse came in to check my vitals, her cheerful efficiency a welcome distraction from my thoughts. "How are we feeling this evening?" she asked, adjusting my IV drip. "Like I've been hit by a truck," I said, attempting a smile. "Well, a Dodge Ram, technically," she replied with surprising humor. "But you're healing nicely. Dr. Patel is pleased with your progress. Any idea when I can get out of here?" She checked my chart, lips pursed thoughtfully. "Another few days at least. That femur fracture is no joke, and they want to monitor your concussion symptoms a bit longer." She looked up, her expression softening. "Your stepmother mentioned you might be anxious about medical costs. Please don't worry. Your insurance is covering most of it, and the driver's insurance will handle the rest." Of course Diana would have mentioned that, planting seeds of financial worry, reinforcing the narrative that I couldn't possibly manage without her guidance. "Thanks, but I'm not concerned," I said, ignoring the twinge of pain as I reached for the water cup on my tray. "My mother made sure I'd be taken care of." The nurse nodded, seemingly relieved. "That's good to hear. Family support makes all the difference in recovery. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel." Now back to where we left off. If only she knew. After she left, I picked up my phone again. Eleanor had sent another message. "Initial steps taken. Do you want me to contact Thomas directly, or wait?" I considered the question carefully. My father wasn't a bad man, just a devastatingly weak one where Diana was concerned. Would confronting him immediately push him further into her corner, or wake him up to what was happening? "Wait," I decided. "Let me talk to him first, but document everything." "Already done," came the swift reply. "Rest now. We have time. Time." Diana thought she'd won, thought she'd secured Blake's future at the expense of mine. She didn't realize she'd just started a countdown to her own undoing. Outside my window, the sun had finally set, plunging the room into darkness until the automatic sensors triggered the soft nighttime lighting. I stared at the shadowed ceiling, feeling a strange sense of peace despite everything. I thought about my mother's final days, how even as cancer ravaged her body, her mind had remained sharp, focused on securing my future. "People will show you who they are, Alex," she'd told me. Believe them the first time. Diana had shown me exactly who she was today. Now it was my turn to show her who I really was. Not the fragile, manipulable stepchild she thought she knew, but my mother's child through and through. Calculating, patient, and absolutely unwilling to let injustice stand. As I drifted into a medication-induced sleep, I found myself smiling slightly. Diana Reynolds Mitchell had made a critical error today, one she'd soon come to regret. She'd underestimated me, and that would be her downfall. Morning arrived with the clatter of breakfast, trays, and the squeak of nurses' shoes against linoleum. I awoke to find Dr. Patel conducting his rounds, his expression thoughtful as he reviewed my chart. "Good morning, Alex. How's the pain today?" he asked, dark eyes scrutinizing my face for signs of discomfort. "Manageable," I replied, which wasn't entirely a lie. The physical pain had settled into a dull roar I could function through. The emotional betrayal, that was another matter entirely. Dr. Patel nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Your latest scans look promising. The femur fracture is aligned well, and the brain swelling has reduced significantly." He paused, then added more, gently. "I understand your stepmother visited yesterday. She mentioned you might be experiencing some emotional distress." Of course she had. Diana was nothing if not thorough, already laying groundwork to question my mental stability. I smiled faintly, meeting the doctor's concerned gaze directly. "Actually, we had a very clarifying conversation," I said evenly. It helped me realize exactly where I stand. Dr. Patel's eyebrows rose slightly, but his professional demeanor remained intact. "I see. Well, if you'd like to speak with someone, we have excellent counselors on staff. Thank you, but I'm fine. Really." I adjusted myself higher on the pillows, wincing only slightly as my ribs protested. "When can I start physical therapy? I'd like to get back on my feet as soon as possible." The doctor smiled, clearly relieved by my apparent focus on recovery. "We can begin tomorrow with some basic movement exercises. Nothing strenuous yet. That femur needs time to heal properly. But your attitude is exactly what we want to see." After he left, I reached again for my phone. 3 missed calls from my father and a text. "Diana told me about your conversation. We need to talk." I set the phone down without responding. Let him stew a little longer. Instead, I opened my email and found exactly what I was hoping for. A message from Eleanor Blackwood with an attachment labeled Contingency Documentation. "As requested, here are the records your mother prepared. Pay particular attention to sections 3 and 7. Call when you're ready to proceed." I opened the attachment with fingers that trembled slightly from more than just physical weakness. The document was extensive. Page after page of financial statements, legal declarations, and most importantly, a detailed record of every interaction my mother had with Diana Reynolds before her death. My eyes widened as I scrolled through the material. Mom had been far more thorough than I'd realized. She hadn't just suspected Diana might eventually come after my inheritance. She'd documented every subtle red flag, every inconsistency in Diana's background, every manipulative comment, made when she thought no one was paying attention. Section 3 contained the real bombshell, a private investigator's report on Diana's background. The old money she claimed to come from was entirely fictional. Before meeting my father, she'd been on the verge of bankruptcy, with multiple maxed-out credit cards and a history of relationships with wealthy men that mysteriously ended once their finances were intertwined. Section 7 outlined the true structure of my trust fund, the one Diana thought she'd emptied. What she didn't know, what my father apparently didn't know either, was that the accessible trust was only a fraction of my inheritance. The bulk of my mother's estate was held in a secondary trust, one that required my explicit consent and presence for any withdrawals or transfers. Mom had created a decoy, a substantial one at $1.2 million, but still only about a third of my actual inheritance. I laughed softly, then grimaced as the movement sent pain shooting through my ribs. Even from beyond the grave, Caroline Mitchell was protecting me, outmaneuvering the woman who'd tried to take her place. A knock at the door interrupted my reading. I quickly closed the document and set my phone aside as a familiar figure stepped into the room. "Hey, superstar, you look like hell." My best friend, Mia Ramirez, stood in the doorway, arms laden with a potted plant, a stack of books, and what appeared to be homemade cookies. Her usual spiky black hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept much. "You drove all the way from Boston?" I asked, genuinely surprised. Mia was in her final year of medical school at Harvard, with barely enough time to sleep, let alone make a 4-hour drive to visit. When your best friend gets T-boned by a drunk driver? Yeah, I make time. She set her gifts down and carefully embraced me, mindful of my injuries. I came as soon as my rotation ended. Would have been here sooner, but apparently being in the ICU means limited visitors. Perks of being upgraded to a regular room, I said, returning her hug with my good arm. Thanks for coming. Mia pulled up a chair, her expression growing serious. So, apart from the obvious physical trauma, how are you really? Your dad called me yesterday sounding weird. Something about Diana visiting you? I studied my oldest friend's face. Mia had been there through everything. My mother's illness, Diana's arrival, my gradually deteriorating relationship with my father. She was one of the few people who saw through Diana's carefully cultivated charm from day one. She drained my trust fund, I said simply, watching Mia's expression shift from concern to outrage. Transferred it all to Blake's name while I was unconscious. That conniving... Mia cut herself off, taking a deep breath. How is that even possible? Wasn't it protected? Dad had administrative access until I turned 25. Apparently, she convinced him to authorize the transfer. I kept my voice deliberately calm, which only seemed to agitate Mia further. And you're just okay with this? Alex, that's over $1 million. Your future, your security. I reached out and squeezed her hand. I didn't say I was okay with it. I said she did it. Something in my tone made Mia pause. She narrowed her eyes, studying me with the clinical assessment she'd been developing through years of medical training. What aren't you telling me? For the first time since Diana's visit, I allowed myself a genuine smile. Mom was smarter than Diana gave her credit for. The trust fund wasn't everything. Understanding dawned on Mia's face, followed by a slow, appreciative grin. Caroline Mitchell forever 10 steps ahead. Her smile faded slightly. But still, they stole from you. That's fraud, Alex. Criminal fraud. I know. I shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position. And they're going to pay for it. But I need to be smart, strategic. Mia nodded, then reached for her bag and pulled out her laptop. Well, luckily for you, I brought reinforcements. What do you need? Access to my cloud storage, for starters. Password is your mom's birthday. Plus mine, with an exclamation point at the end. I know your password patterns, Mitchell. She was already typing. What am I looking for? A folder labeled Insurance. There should be recordings. For the past 2 years, ever since I'd first noticed inconsistencies in the trust fund statements, my father forwarded I'd been quietly documenting every interaction with Diana and my father regarding finances. Connecticut was a one-party consent state for recordings, which meant those conversations were completely legal evidence. Mia whistled low as she opened the folder. There are dozens of files here. You've been busy. Cautious, I corrected. Diana's been dropping hints about redistributing family resources for months. I wanted to be prepared. Always the programmer, documenting everything. Mia clicked through a few files. This is gold, Alex. Absolute gold. I nodded, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. Having Mia here, having someone who understood the situation without requiring lengthy explanations, was exactly what I needed. There's more, I said, gesturing to my phone. Eleanor Blackwood, Mom's attorney. She's been monitoring the trust. She has records of every transaction, every access attempt. And now, evidence of the unauthorized transfer. Mia's eyes widened. You've been working with your mom's lawyer? For how long? About 8 months. Ever since Diana started asking pointed questions about when I'd finally get access to the trust. I shifted again, wincing. Eleanor warned me something like this might happen. We just didn't expect Diana to be quite so opportunistic about my accident. Opportunistic is a very polite word for what she is, Mia muttered. So what's the plan? Police report? Lawsuit? I shook my head slowly. Not yet. First, I need to talk to my father. Give him one chance to fix this before everything explodes. Mia looked skeptical. You really think Thomas will stand up to her? After all this time? It was a fair question. My father had been under Diana's influence for 8 years, gradually transformed from the attentive, loving dad I'd grown up with into a stranger who seemed perpetually disappointed in me. But despite everything, some small part of me still hoped there was something of the old Thomas Mitchell left. The man who had taught me to code when I was 10, who had supported my mother through every step of her illness, who had once promised he would always protect me. "I have to try," I said finally. "If only so I can look myself in the mirror afterward and know I gave him a chance." Mia nodded, understanding in her eyes. "When?" "Tomorrow. I need to get my thoughts in order first." And I was interrupted by my phone buzzing again. Another text from my father. "Alex, please. We need to talk about this. Diana says you're upset." I showed the message to Mia, who rolled her eyes. "Diana says you're upset. Not Diana stole your inheritance, but you're upset." Unbelievable. Classic. Deflection, I agreed, making it about my emotional reaction rather than her actions. Mia studied me for a moment. "You're taking this remarkably well. If it were me, I'd be breathing fire." I looked out the window at the autumn trees, their leaves turning brilliant shades of red and gold before they fell. Being angry won't get my money back. Being smart will. The rest of the afternoon passed in companionable work. Mia helped me organize the evidence, categorizing recordings and documents while I drafted a careful, measured response to my father, agreeing to meet the following day. By evening, we had a clear picture of what we were dealing with and a strategy for moving forward. "I should head out," Mia said reluctantly, checking her watch. "Visiting hours are almost over, and I'm crashing at my cousin's place in town." "Thank you," I said, reaching for her hand. "For dropping everything to come here." She squeezed my fingers, as if there was ever a question. "Besides," she added with a grin, "I wouldn't miss the downfall of Diana Reynolds Mitchell for anything in the world." After Mia left, a different nurse came in for my evening checkup, an older woman with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes. "You had a visitor," she remarked, checking my IV. "That's good. Support system is important for recovery." "She's the best," I agreed. "Known her since we were kids." The nurse nodded approvingly. "Much better than family sometimes. Speaking of which," she lowered her voice slightly, "your stepmother called the nurse's station earlier. Wanted to know if you'd been emotionally stable today." I was tense. "And what did you tell her?" "That patient information is confidential," she replied with a small smile. "And that if she had concerns, she should discuss them with you directly." "Thank you." "You," I said, surprised and grateful. She patted my hand. "Been a nurse for 30 years, honey. I know a manipulator when I hear one." She finished adjusting my medication. "Now get some rest. Healing bodies need sleep." After she left, I settled back against the pillows, mind racing despite my physical exhaustion. Diana was already laying groundwork, trying to paint me as emotionally unstable. It was a clever tactic. Who would believe someone they thought was irrational or mentally compromised? But Diana's usual tactics relied on isolation. She'd spent years systematically separating me from my father, from family friends, from anyone who might offer a contrary perspective to her carefully constructed narrative. What she hadn't counted on was the network I'd built for myself. Mia, Eleanor, even the medical staff who were proving surprisingly perceptive about her manipulations. My phone buzzed with an email notification. Eleanor again. "Alex, I've reviewed the transfer documentation. Diana forged your signature on 3 separate forms. We have her dead to rights on this. Let me know when you're ready to proceed." I typed a quick response. "Meeting with my father tomorrow. We'll update you afterward. Have all documentation ready." As night settled over the hospital, I found myself thinking about Blake. He was 20 now, in his junior year at an expensive private university, one my father was struggling to afford, according to overheard conversations. Had he known about Diana's plan? Was he complicit in stealing my inheritance, or just another pawn in his mother's game? Blake and I had never been close, but our relationship hadn't always been antagonistic. In those early years, I genuinely tried to be a good step-sibling. It was only after Diana began actively pitting us against each other, praising his mediocre achievements while dismissing my accomplishments, allocating family resources inequitably, creating artificial scarcity and competition, that Blake had started viewing me as an enemy rather than family. I couldn't entirely blame him. Blake had been raised by Diana, shaped by her values and worldview from birth. He'd watched her manipulate and scheme his entire life. It was the only model of adult behavior he really knew. And children, even adult children, naturally align with their parents' perspective, especially when that perspective casts them as more deserving, more important, more worthy of love and resources. Still, the question lingered. How involved was Blake in what Diana had done? And what would happen to him when her house of cards finally collapsed? Morning arrived with fresh determination. After a short physical therapy session, mostly gentle movements to prevent muscle atrophy without disturbing my healing bones, I asked the nurse to help me look presentable for my father's visit. "Special occasion?" she asked, helping me change into a clean t-shirt Mia had brought from my apartment. "You could say that," I replied. "Family meeting." She gave me a knowing look. "Want me to be nearby?" Sometimes family meetings in hospitals get intense. I smiled at her perceptiveness. "I'll be fine, but thank you." By the time my father arrived at 11, I was sitting up in bed, hair brushed, expression calm and composed. The bruises on my face had faded from angry purple to a sickly yellow-green, but I knew I still looked fragile, which could work to my advantage. Thomas Mitchell entered hesitantly, as if unsure of his welcome. At 53, he was still handsome, though. His dark hair had gone silver at the temples, and new lines creased his forehead. He carried a small gift bag and a bouquet of lilies, my mother's favorite flowers, a detail that didn't escape my notice. "Alex," he said softly, setting the flowers on the bedside table. "You look better. Better than unconsciousness in the ICU is a low bar, Dad," I replied, keeping my tone neutral rather than accusatory. He winced, taking the visitor's chair Mia had occupied the day before. "I deserved that. I'm sorry I haven't been here more. The business—" "Let's not pretend this visit is about checking on my recovery," I interrupted. "You're here because Diana told you she visited, because she told you what she did." My father's face fell, confirming my suspicion. He had hoped to ease into the conversation rather than addressing it directly. Always the conflict avoider, my father. "Alex, it's not what you think," he began, his voice taking on the placating tone I'd grown to recognize over the years, the one he used when trying to explain away Diana's behavior. "The trust reallocation was about securing both your futures. Blake needed—" "Relocation?" I echoed, allowing a hint of steel to enter my voice. "Is that what we're calling theft and fraud now?" His eyes widened. "That's not fair. This was a family decision about—" "A family decision I wasn't consulted on, while I was unconscious. About money that was explicitly left to me by my mother." I kept my voice even, watching his face as each point landed. "And let's be completely clear. Diana forged my signature to make it happen." My father paled. "She wouldn't—" "Say she did. I've seen the documentation." I leaned forward slightly, ignoring the twinge in my ribs. "Did you even read what you were signing, Dad? Or did you just trust Diana was telling you the truth?" The flash of uncertainty in his eyes gave me my answer. Diana had played him as she always did, presenting him with paperwork, assuring him it was routine, necessary, in everyone's best interest. And my father, conflict-averse and blinded by his trust in his wife, had signed without verifying. "Alex, you have to understand," he tried again. "Blake's tuition is due, and the business has been struggling. And Diana thought—" "I don't care what Diana thought," I said, my calm finally slipping. "That money was mine, my mother's final gift to me, and you let Diana steal it." A tear slipped down my cheek, not from sadness, but from pure frustration. 8 years of watching my father choose Diana over me, choose peace over truth, choose the path of least resistance over what was right. My father reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "You have exactly one chance to fix this," I said, my voice low and steady despite the emotion bubbling beneath. "One chance, Dad, before I take this to the authorities. Before Diana faces criminal charges for fraud. Before your name gets dragged into a very public, very ugly legal battle." He stared at me, shock evident in his expression. "You wouldn't." "I would." "I am." I met his gaze unflinchingly. "The money gets transferred back to my account. Every penny. By the end of the week." "Alex, it's not that simple. The money's already been—" "Not my problem. Figure it out." I paused, then added, "And you need to understand something, Dad. This isn't just about the money. This is about 8 years of watching Diana manipulate you, manipulate me, manipulate this entire family. It ends now." My father sat in stunned silence, the gift bag forgotten in his lap. For perhaps the first time, he was seeing me not as his child to be managed or placated, but as an adult with boundaries he couldn't cross, with determination he couldn't bend. "You sound like your mother," he said finally, his voice barely audible. I smiled faintly. "Good. Because Mom would never have let this happen." He flinched as if I'd struck him, then slowly nodded. I'll talk to Diana. Figure something out." "Don't talk. Act." I picked up my phone, making the gesture deliberate. "And Dad? This conversation has been recorded, just like every financial conversation I've had with you and Diana for the past 2 years." The color drained from his face. "You've been recording us?" "Connecticut is a one-party consent state," I said calmly. "Legally, I don't need to inform you." He stood abruptly, the gift bag tumbling to the floor forgotten. "I need to go." "You have until Friday," I reminded him. "After that, the recordings, the forged documents, everything goes to the authorities." As he reached the door, he paused, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Perhaps regret, perhaps fear, perhaps a dawning realization of just how badly he had misjudged both his wife and his child. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I'm sorry it came to this." After he left, I exhaled slowly, feeling the adrenaline drain away. My hands were shaking, but not from weakness, from certainty. The game had begun, and Diana had no idea what she was up against. The hours after my father's visit crawled by with excruciating slowness. Physical therapy left me exhausted but restless, my body craving both rest and movement simultaneously. Dr. Patel had mentioned I might be discharged within the next few days if my progress continued, a prospect both welcome and daunting. My apartment was a third-floor walk-up, hardly ideal for someone with a shattered femur and cracked ribs. Zas afternoon shadows lengthened across my hospital room. My phone chimed with a text from Mia. "Meeting with your dad go as expected?" I typed back. "Pretty much." Shocked, defensive, then apologetic. Said he'll talk to Diana. Her response was immediate. Translation: "He'll fold like origami the moment she turns on the waterworks." I couldn't argue with her assessment. My father's pattern was depressingly predictable when it came to Diana. Initial resistance, followed by capitulation, followed by adopting her perspective as his own. I had seen it happen countless times over the years, watching my once decisive father become increasingly malleable under her influence. "Any words from Eleanor?" Mia texted again. "Not yet. Waiting to see if Dad makes good on his promise before escalating." Tati. Truth was, despite my confident ultimatum, I was dreading the next step. Taking legal action against Diana meant potentially destroying what remained of my relationship with my father. While that relationship had become increasingly strained under Diana's influence, some childish part of me still hoped for reconciliation, for a return to the closeness we'd once shared. My thoughts drifted back to the time before Diana, before my mother's illness, when the Mitchell family had been whole and happy. Growing up in our comfortable colony in Greenwich, Connecticut, I had enjoyed a childhood of privilege and security. My father, then a rising executive at a software company, and my mother, a brilliant biochemist who had stepped back from her career to raise me, had created a home filled with books, music, and lively intellectual debate. From my earliest memories, my father had been my champion, teaching me chess at 5, building model rockets with me in the backyard, encouraging my budding interest in computer programming. When I showed an aptitude for coding, he had been ecstatic, spending weekends helping me with increasingly complex projects. "You've got your mother's brain," he would say proudly, "and maybe a bit of your old man's persistence." Those golden years had ended abruptly when my mother was diagnosed with stage IV ovarian cancer. I was 15, just starting my sophomore year of high school, when she first collapsed in the kitchen. The memory still came to me in fragments, the sound of breaking glass as the bowl she'd been holding shattered against the tile floor, the strange gray pallor of her skin, my father's panicked voice calling 911. The next 18 months had been a blur of hospital visits, chemotherapy sessions, brief periods of hope cruelly dashed by recurrence. Through it all, my father had been steadfast, taking family leave to care for my mother, researching experimental treatments, holding her hand through the worst of the pain. And I had tried to be strong, maintaining my grades, taking on household responsibilities, pretending not to notice how thin my mother grew, how the light in her eyes dimmed with each passing month. A week after my 17th birthday, Caroline Mitchell died peacefully at home, my father and I at her bedside. Her final words to me, whispered through cracked lips, "Remember who you are, always." In the aftermath of her death, my father and I had clung to each other, grief binding us together even as it threatened to drown us individually. For 6 months, we had muddled through, creating new routines, learning to navigate a world without Caroline's steady presence. It wasn't perfect. My father threw himself into work with almost manic intensity, and I retreated into academics and coding projects. But we were healing slowly, together. Then Diana Reynolds appeared at a charity gala my father's company sponsored. Looking back, I could see how perfectly positioned she had been, seated at his table, introduced by a mutual acquaintance who knew Thomas was recently widowed, dressed elegantly but not flashily. Her conversation skillfully drawing him out of his shell for perhaps the first time since my mother's death. Their courtship had been whirlwind fast. Within 2 months, Diana was a regular presence in our home. 2 months after that, she and Blake had moved in. And 6 months to the day after meeting her, my father had announced their engagement. "It's fast, I know," he had said, misinterpreting my stunned silence as concern rather than shock. "But when you know, you know. Diana makes me happy, Alex. I think your mother would want that for me." The invocation of my mother's wishes had felt like a betrayal, but I had swallowed my objections. My father deserved happiness, and if Diana provided that, who was I to stand in the way? Besides, Blake seemed like a quiet, somewhat withdrawn kid who might benefit from a stable home environment. Maybe, I had thought optimistically, we could form a new kind of family. Different, but still loving. That hope had lasted approximately 3 weeks after the wedding, as the changes were subtle at first. Diana suggested rearranging the living room, removing a reading chair my mother had loved. Family dinners, once filled with conversation about books, current events, and ideas, became focused on Blake's activities and achievements. My father's attention, previously divided equally between work and home, shifted to accommodate Diana's social ambitions: charity committees, country club memberships, networking events. By the time I left for college, our home had been transformed. Family photos were rearranged to emphasize the new family unit, with images of my mother relegated to less prominent positions. My childhood bedroom was refreshed during my freshman year, my posters and mementos boxed up to create a more mature space. Even holiday traditions changed, with Diana instituting new customs that erased the ones my mother and father had created together. None of these changes, taken individually, seemed worth confronting. Each time I considered raising concerns, I heard my father's voice. Diana makes me happy. Who was I to disrupt that happiness over something as trivial as furniture arrangement or holiday menus? But the cumulative effect was undeniable. I was being systematically erased from the family narrative, replaced by Blake and Diana's vision of what our family should be. And my father, perhaps desperate to believe he had found lasting happiness again, either didn't notice or chose not to see. The financial manipulation had begun during my sophomore year of college. Seemingly innocuous questions about my trust fund, comments about the burden of college expenses, suggestions that I take out student loans, like most kids have to do, despite the fact that my mother had explicitly set aside money for my education. When I pushed back, citing my mother's wishes, Diana had been masterful in her response. Of course your mother wanted to provide for you, she had said, her voice a perfect blend of understanding and concern. But she couldn't have anticipated how the family would grow, how needs would change. Blake doesn't have the advantages you've had, Alex. Wouldn't your mother want us to ensure both children have equal opportunities? Equal opportunities. It was a phrase Diana returned to frequently, always framing financial decisions as matters of fairness rather than appropriation. Blake needed a car to commute to his private high school. It was only fair that funds from my trust cover it, since my college was close enough to use public transportation. Blake required tutoring for his dyslexia. Surely I wouldn't begrudge using educational funds from my trust, since I was naturally gifted and didn't need such support. Each request came with subtle implications. Refusing meant I was selfish, entitled, unwilling to share with my stepbrother. And each time my father sided with Diana, the message became clearer. Blake's needs trumped mine. Diana's vision for our family superseded my mother's carefully laid plans. A knock at my hospital room door jolted me from these memories. A nurse I hadn't seen before poked her head in. "You have another visitor if you're up for it," she said cheerfully. "Young man? Says he's your brother?" My pulse quickened. Blake. I hadn't expected him to visit, hadn't even been sure if Diana had told him about our confrontation. "Stepbrother," I corrected automatically. "But yes, I'll see him." She nodded and disappeared, returning moments later with Blake Reynolds in tow. At 20, he had grown into his lankiness, no longer the awkward 12-year-old I had first met. Dressed in designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than a month of my rent, he stood awkwardly at the foot of my bed, hands shoved in his pockets. "Hey," he said, voice uncertain. "You look rough." I almost laughed at the understatement. "Turns out getting hit by a drunk driver will do that to you." He winced, then gestured vaguely to the visitor's chair. "Can I?" I nodded, studying him as he sat down. Blake and I had never been close, but we'd maintained a sort of distant civility over the years. He wasn't a bad kid, not really, just entitled and sheltered by Diana's constant coddling. In another life, under different circumstances, perhaps we could have been friends. "Mom told me about your talk," he said abruptly, eyes fixed on the floor. "About the trust fund." I tensed, bracing for accusations, for the defense of Diana I'd expected. Instead, Blake looked up, his expression surprisingly conflicted. "Did you know?" I asked carefully. "About the transfer?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Not until yesterday. She said it was a reallocation that Dad approved, to help with my tuition and some investments she's making for my future. He paused, then added more quietly, "She didn't mention it. Was your entire inheritance." I studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. Blake had been Diana's willing accomplice in many schemes over the years, but he seemed genuinely uncomfortable now. "And how do you feel about that?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He shifted in his seat. "Honestly, it's messed up. I mean, I know Mom's always been aggressive about making sure I get opportunities, but taking your entire trust fund?" He shook his head. "That crosses a line." The admission surprised me. Blake had never before acknowledged Diana's manipulations and had always accepted her favoritism as his due. This flash of self-awareness was unexpected. "Why are you here, Blake?" I asked directly. "Not that I don't appreciate the visit, but we both know we're not exactly close." He sighed, running a hand through his carefully styled hair. "Dad called me this morning, freaking out. Said you were threatening legal action, that Mom might face fraud charges." He met my gaze. "Is that true?" I considered my response carefully. Blake might be showing a glimmer of independent thought, but he was still Diana's son, still potentially her eyes and ears. "What Diana did was illegal," I said finally. "Forging my signature, transferring funds without authorization, those are crimes, Blake. So yes, legal action is on the table if the money isn't returned." He nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this answer. "And if it is returned, you'll drop it?" "The criminal part, yes." I studied his reaction. "Why? Has Diana sent you to negotiate on her behalf?" Blake's face flushed. "No, she doesn't even know I'm here. I just—" He broke off, seeming to struggle with what to say next. "Look, whatever you think of me, I don't want to see my mom go to jail, or Dad gets dragged into some public legal battle." I softened slightly. Despite everything, Blake was just trying to protect his family, misguided as his mother might be. "I don't want that either, Blake. I just want what's mine, what my mother left for me." He nodded again, more decisively this time. "Okay, I'll talk to Mom, try to make her see the reason." I couldn't help the skeptical expression that crossed my face. Diana wasn't exactly known for her reasonableness, particularly when it came to financial matters. Blake noticed my doubt and smiled faintly. I know. But she listens to me sometimes. And if she knows you're serious about pressing charges—" He let the implication hang in the air. "Friday," I reminded him. "That's the deadline." He stood, adjusting his expensive sweater with the unconscious gesture of someone accustomed to fine things. "I'll do what I can." As he reached the door, I called after him. "Blake, thank you for coming." He paused, looking back with an expression I couldn't quite read. "We're family, right? Sort of, anyway." Then he was gone, leaving me to wonder if his visit had been genuine concern or just another play in Diana's complex game. I reached for my phone, texting Mia. "Blake just visited. Says he didn't know about the trust fund transfer. Offered to talk to Diana." Her response came quickly. "You believe him?" I considered the question. Blake had seemed sincere, but he had also been raised by Diana, schooled in her particular brand of manipulation since childhood. "Not sure," I replied honestly. "But it doesn't change the plan either way." The plan. It sounded so clinical, so calculated. Yet as I lay in my hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, I knew calculation was exactly what was needed. Diana had spent years orchestrating my marginalization within the family, my separation from my father, and finally, the theft of my inheritance. Fighting back required equal strategic thinking, equal determination. My phone buzzed again. Eleanor this time. "Just heard from Thomas Mitchell's attorney. They're reviewing the situation and will be in touch before Friday. Progress, but stay vigilant." So my father had consulted a lawyer. That could be good or bad. Either he was taking my threat seriously, or he was looking for legal loopholes to protect Diana. Either way, the wheels were in motion. As evening approached, a different nurse helped me to the bathroom, then assisted with changing into fresh hospital clothes. Small dignities, but they mattered after days of illness and injury. "You're looking stronger today," she commented, helping me back to bed. "Must be all those visitors. Support makes a difference in recovery rates, you know." I smiled at her. "They help, though some visits are more stressful than others," she laughed knowingly. "Family, right? Can't live with them. Can't throw them out the hospital window without violating several laws." The joke startled a genuine laugh from me, followed immediately by a wince as my ribs protested. "Sorry, honey," she said, adjusting my pillows. "Didn't mean to make you hurt yourself." "Worth it," I assured her, settling back as comfortably as possible. I needed that. After she left, I found myself thinking about her casual comment. Family. What did that word even mean anymore? For years, Diana had warped its definition in our household, creating arbitrary divisions between real family and everyone else. Blood relation became the ultimate currency, with Blake and her at the center of the family circle, my father adjacent to them, and me positioned firmly on the periphery. Yet, here was Mia, dropping everything to drive hours to be by my side. Eleanor. Blackwood, honoring a promise made to my mother years after her death. Even the hospital staff, with their small kindnesses and perceptive comments, offered more genuine care than Diana had shown me in 8 years of supposed family connection. Perhaps family wasn't about blood or marriage certificates or legal definitions. Perhaps it was simpler and more profound. The people who showed up, who saw you clearly, who stood with you when it mattered. By that definition, Diana had never been family at all. Night fell, bringing the muted sounds of a hospital shifting to evening routines, quieter voices, softer footsteps, the distant chime of call buttons. I checked my phone one last time before setting it aside to sleep, a text from my father. "Working on resolving the situation. Please don't do anything until we've had a chance to talk again." No mention of Diana. No acknowledgement of his role in what had happened. Just another request for time, for patience, for me to sit quietly while others determined my fate. Not this time. I typed back a single word. Friday. Then I turned off the light and closed my eyes, letting exhaustion pull me. Tomorrow would bring another day of physical therapy, another step toward recovery, another move in the silent chess match with Diana, and I was done playing by her rules. Wednesday morning arrived with a development I hadn't anticipated. Dr. Patel approved my discharge for Friday afternoon, provided my next physical therapy session went well. "You're healing nicely," he said, reviewing my latest scans. "The concussion symptoms have subsided, and while that femur will need time, you can continue recovery at home with outpatient PT." Home. The word conjured my small but comfortable apartment, 15 minutes from my office, not my father's house, which hadn't felt like home in years. But my apartment presented its own challenges. 3rd floor walk-up, tiny bathroom, no one to help with daily tasks while my mobility remained limited. "Is there someone who can assist you?" Dr. Patel asked, seemingly reading my thoughts. "The first few weeks of home recovery are challenging, especially with your combination of injuries." Before I could respond, a familiar voice answered from the doorway. "She'll be staying with me?" Mia announced, striding into the room with the confidence of someone who'd made up her mind. "My cousin's place has a 1st-floor guest room and a walk-in shower. Plus, I've got another week before I need to be back in Boston." Dr. Patel smiled. "Perfect. I'll have the discharge coordinator go over everything with both of you on Friday." After he left, I turned to Mia with raised eyebrows. "Don't you think you should have asked me first?" She rolled her eyes, dropping into the visitor's chair. "Please. Like you had a better option. Besides, Sarah's place is closer to your physical therapy appointments, and she's thrilled to help." Says it'll be like our college spring break, except with fewer margaritas and more prescription painkillers. I laughed despite myself. Well, when you put it that way. Mia's expression grew more serious. Any updates from the financial front? I filled her in on Blake's surprise visit, my father's text, and Eleanor's report about Thomas consulting an attorney. Mia listened intently, her medical training evident in the way she cataloged information without immediate judgment. So Blake's playing good cop, she said when I finished. Interesting angle. You think Diana put him up to it? I shook my head. I don't think so. He seemed genuinely uncomfortable with what she did. But then again, Diana's a master manipulator. And he's had 20 years of her influence, Mia finished my thought. Hard to know where Diana's coaching ends and Blake's genuine feelings begin. We spent the morning strategizing, with Mia helping me draft emails to Eleanor and my boss at the tech startup where I worked as a junior developer. By lunch, I had formally requested medical leave from work, arranged for remote access to my projects where possible, and confirmed with Eleanor that all legal pieces were in place if Friday's deadline passed without resolution. Mia left after lunch, promising to return the next day with clothes and essentials for my discharge. As the afternoon stretched into evening, I found myself alone with my thoughts, replaying the events that had led me to this hospital bed. The accident itself remained fragmented in my memory. Bright flashes of sensation rather than a coherent narrative. I remembered working late at Next Gen Solutions, the small but promising startup where I'd been employed for the past 18 months. We were approaching a product launch deadline, and as one of the newer developers, I was determined to prove myself. It had been nearly 9 p.m. when my team lead, Marcus, had finally insisted everyone go home. Code will still be here tomorrow, people. Go get some sleep. The parking garage had been nearly empty by then, my modest Honda Civic one of the few remaining vehicles. I remembered texting Mia about our weekend plans, remembered switching on a podcast for the drive home, remembered the heavy rain that had been falling all day finally beginning to ease. What came next existed only in disjointed images, headlights suddenly blinding me from the right, the sickening realization that the approaching vehicle wasn't slowing for the red light, the instinctive jerk of the steering wheel as I tried to avoid impact, the deafening crunch of metal collapsing, the strange weightless sensation as my car spun across the intersection, the airbag deploying with concussive force, and then nothing. 3 days lost to unconsciousness and emergency surgeries. When I finally regained awareness in the ICU, it was to the beeping of monitors and the concerned face of a nurse I didn't recognize. My first coherent thought had been confusion about my whereabouts, followed quickly by panic about the deadlines. I was certainly missing at work. Only later, as the medical team explained the extent of my injuries, did the reality of my situation begin to sink in. A compound fracture of the right femur, requiring surgical repair with titanium rods. 3. Broken ribs, a moderate concussion, various cuts and contusions from shattered glass and the impact. Weeks, possibly months of recovery ahead, and in those 3 days of unconsciousness, Diana had made her move. Had she been planning it all along, just waiting for the right opportunity? Or had the accident presented a sudden, irresistible opening she couldn't pass up? Either way, the calculation was chilling, using my life-threatening injuries as cover to raid my inheritance while my father was distracted by concern for my survival. The more I thought about it, the more I suspected this had been Diana's plan for some time. The increasing questions about my trust fund over the past year, the comments about Blake's tuition struggles, the subtle digs about my privileged position compared to her son. She had been laying groundwork, preparing my father to see the theft as reasonable redistribution rather than criminal betrayal. My phone buzzed, interrupting these dark reflections. A text from an unknown number. "This is Blake. Can we talk? It's important." I hesitated, unsure if this was another manipulation or a genuine overture. After deliberation, I replied, "I'm not up for another hospital visit today. If you want to talk, text or call." The response came quickly. "Can't talk at home." Mom would hear, "Can I call you in 20 min? I'll be on campus." "Okay," I texted back, curiosity overcoming caution. True to his word, exactly 20 minutes later, my phone rang with Blake's call. "Hey," he said, his voice hushed despite his assurance of privacy. "Thanks for agreeing to talk." "What's going on, Blake?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He exhaled heavily. "I talked to Mom about returning the money. It didn't go well." Let me guess. Tears, indignation, insistence that she did nothing wrong? "Worse," he said, surprising me. "She admitted everything. Said she'd been planning it for months, waiting. For the right moment. Said Dad knew more than he's letting on." I sat up straighter, ignoring the twinge in my ribs. "He knew about the forgery?" "Not exactly. But she said he knew she was rebalancing family resources and looked the other way on the details. Said he was tired of your mother's money creating artificial divisions in the family." The phrasing was pure Diana, but the implication that my father had been complicit, even peripherally, felt like another betrayal. "And you believe her?" I asked. "I don't know what to believe anymore," Blake admitted, his voice uncharacteristically vulnerable. "But I found something weird when I was looking for my birth certificate in her office yesterday." My interest sharpened. "What kind of weird?" "Financial statements, but not from our regular bank. Offshore accounts, I think, and documents about property in her maiden name, a condo in Boca Raton I've never heard her mention." My pulse quickened. If Diana had been hiding assets from my father, that opened a whole new dimension to her deception. "Did you take photos?" I asked, trying to keep the eagerness from my voice. "Better," Blake replied, and I could hear the grim satisfaction in his tone. "I scanned everything to my cloud drive. I'll send you access." I was momentarily speechless. Blake, Diana's golden child, her perfect son, was essentially betraying her confidence. It was the last thing I had expected. "Why are you doing this?" I finally asked. "Why help me against your mother?" There was a long pause. Then Blake said quietly, "Because what she did was wrong. And because—" He hesitated again. "Because I found out she's been lying to me too. About everything. My college fund that she said was running low? It's not. She's been diverting money to these other accounts for years, using my tuition as an excuse to pull from your trust, while hiding money that was supposed to be for my education." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. Diana hadn't just been stealing from me. She'd been using Blake as the justification while secretly building her own financial escape hatch. "Blake," I said carefully, "have you shown any of this to your father?" "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first. Figure out how to handle it." Smart. If Diana had even an inkling that Blake had discovered her secret accounts, she would move quickly to cover her tracks. "Don't confront her," I advised. "Not yet. Send me everything you found, and I'll share it with Eleanor, my mother's attorney." "And Blake?" "Thank you." He made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "Don't thank me. I should have seen through her years ago like you did." After we disconnected, I immediately called Eleanor, who answered on the second ring. "Alex, any developments?" "You could say that," I replied, then quickly relayed Blake's information about the hidden accounts. "He's sending me scans of everything he found. Could this help our case?" Eleanor's voice took on the precise tone she used when shifting into full legal mode. "If Diana has been concealing assets while claiming financial hardship to justify accessing your trust, that substantially strengthens our position. It transitions from simple fraud to a calculated, premeditated scheme. See, and my father? If he knew, if Thomas was aware, even peripherally, he could face accessory charges, she confirmed gently. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Send me Blake's documents as soon as you receive them, and I'll have my team analyze everything. After we hung up, I lay back against the pillows, mind racing with the implications of Blake's discovery. Diana's betrayal of my father added another layer to her deception. She hadn't just been stealing from me, but potentially planning an exit strategy that didn't include her husband. Within the hour, an email arrived from Blake with a link to a secure folder containing dozens of scanned documents. Even to my untrained eye, the evidence was damning. Account statements from a Cayman Islands bank showing deposits totaling over $300,000. Property records for a Florida condominium purchased 3 years ago solely in Diana's name. And most incriminating of all, a series of transfers from what appeared to be Blake's college fund to these hidden accounts. I forwarded everything to Eleanor with a simple message: "This changes things." Her response was equally concise. "Indeed it does. Stay the course." Friday deadline stands. That night, sleep proved elusive despite my physical exhaustion. The pieces of Diana's scheme were falling into place, revealing a plan more calculated and far-reaching than I had initially suspected. She hadn't just opportunistically grabbed my inheritance during my accident. She had been systematically building towards financial independence, using both my trust fund and Blake's college fund as resources to secure her own future. Did my father know? The question haunted me. Thomas Mitchell was many things: conflict-averse, easily manipulated by Diana, increasingly distant from me. But I had never thought of him as dishonest. Had he really turned a blind eye to Diana's machinations? Or was he as much a victim of her deception as Blake and I were? Morning arrived with no further clarity but a renewed sense of purpose. My physical therapy session went well enough that the therapist confirmed I was on track for Friday's discharge, though she emphasized the need for continued outpatient rehabilitation. "The femur fracture is healing nicely," she explained, helping me practice with the crutches I would need for the next several weeks. But rebuilding strength and mobility takes time and consistent work. As she guided me through gentle exercises designed to maintain muscle tone without disturbing the healing bone, I found myself drawing parallels to my situation with Diana. The damage had been done, both to my body and to my inheritance. Recovery would require patience, strategic effort, and professional guidance. By afternoon, I felt strong enough to sit in a chair by the window rather than remaining confined to bed. The simple change in perspective was invigorating, allowing me to look out over the hospital grounds where autumn leaves drifted from maple trees, their vibrant reds and golds a stark contrast to the sterile white of my room. My phone rang. Eleanor. Again. "I've reviewed the documents Blake provided," she said without preamble. "Alex, this is significant. Diana has been systematically moving money offshore for at least 4 years, including funds she claimed were for Blake's education and family emergencies. What does this mean for our case? It means we have leverage beyond the trust fund issue. If Thomas is unaware of these accounts, which seems likely given the elaborate steps Diana took to conceal them, this information could be valuable in securing his cooperation. I considered this. You think we should tell my father? Strategically, yes, Eleanor confirmed, but carefully. We don't want Diana to know we've discovered these accounts until we're ready to use the information. We discussed tactics for approaching my father with this new evidence, finally settling on a plan. I would text him requesting another hospital visit tomorrow, then present him with selected documents revealing Diana's hidden finances. The hope was that, confronted with evidence of her broader deception, he would be more inclined to side with me regarding the trust fund. Just as we were concluding our call, a nurse appeared with news that surprised me. "You have another visitor," she said. "Says he's a colleague from work?" Curious, I agreed to the visit, expecting perhaps Marcus checking in on behalf of the team. Instead, I was shocked to see Cole Wilson, NextGen's CEO, enter my room. Cole was in his mid-30s, a former Google developer who had started NextGen 3 years ago with ambitious plans to revolutionize healthcare software. As a junior programmer, I rarely interacted with him directly, making his hospital visit all the more unexpected. "Alex," he said warmly, setting a gift basket on the bedside table. "The team sends their best wishes. How are you feeling?" "Better, thank you," I replied, still puzzled by his presence. "It's kind of you to visit, but I'm surprised." "That the CEO would come himself?" Cole smiled, taking the visitor's chair. "I wanted to check on you personally. Your work on the patient interface has been exceptional, and Marcus tells me you were pulling late hours before the accident." I felt a flush of pride at the praise, followed immediately by concern. "The launch deadline. Did the team manage without me?" "We shifted some resources around, but yes, we're on track." He leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. "But that's not actually why I'm here. Your emergency contact at work is your father, correct?" I nodded, suddenly uneasy about where this conversation was heading. "He came by the office yesterday," Cole continued. "Asked about your position, your salary, your performance reviews. At first, I thought he was just concerned about your job security given your injuries, but then he started asking about whether you had any company stock options or retirement accounts." My unease deepened. "What did you tell him?" "Only what's publicly available information. But it struck me as odd, especially when he mentioned something about family financial reorganization necessitated by your accident." Cole studied my face carefully. "Is everything okay, Alex?" Because it seemed like he was trying to assess your financial situation beyond what a concerned parent would normally ask. The implications were clear. My father was investigating my finances, likely at Diana's behest, possibly looking for additional resources to appropriate. "Thank you for telling me," I said, choosing my words carefully. "There's some family financial tension at the moment, nothing that will affect my work once I'm back." Cole nodded, not pressing for details. "Well, your job is secure. Take whatever time you need for recovery." He stood to leave, then added, "And Alex? NextGen values your contributions. If you need anything, including legal counsel, let me know. My sister's a pretty good attorney." After he left, I immediately texted Eleanor about this new development. Her response was swift and concerned. "This suggests they're looking for additional assets to target. Accelerate the timeline. Meet with your father tomorrow, not Friday." I agreed, then sent a message to my father. "We need to talk. Tomorrow morning. At the hospital, 10 a.m. It's urgent." His reply came hours later, just as evening medications were being distributed. "I'll be there." "Diana wants to come too." "No," I texted back firmly. "Just you. What I have to discuss concerns her actions without your knowledge. Come alone, or don't come at all." There was no immediate response, and I wondered if I'd pushed too hard. Would he choose Diana over me yet again? As night fell, bringing with it the peculiar half-silence of a hospital after hours, my phone finally chimed with his answer. "I'll come alone." 10 a.m. I set the phone aside, mentally preparing for what promised to be a difficult conversation. Tomorrow, my father would have to choose between his wife's deception and his daughter's truth, between enabling fraud and restoring justice, between Diana's manipulative influence and the values he'd once held dear. Whatever he decided would determine not just the fate of my inheritance, but the future of our relationship as father and daughter. The thought should have been terrifying, but instead, I felt an odd sense of calm. 7 years of Diana's influence had gradually eroded what my father and I once shared. Tomorrow would reveal how much, if anything, remained worth salvaging. My last thought before sleep claimed me was of my mother, her strength during her illness, her foresight in protecting my inheritance, her final advice to remember who I was. Caroline Mitchell had prepared me for this moment, perhaps knowing, somehow, that Diana would eventually show her true colors. Tomorrow, I would honor that preparation by standing firm in the truth, regardless of my father's response. Because while Diana had taken my trust fund, she couldn't take the most valuable inheritance my mother had left me: the courage to face difficult truths and the strength to fight for what was right. Sleep brought no rest that night. My dreams were fragmented, anxious, Diana's voice weaving through scenarios where I tried to speak but produced no sound, where I ran but couldn't escape, where documents slipped through my fingers like water. I woke frequently, checking the time, calculating. How long until my father's visit? By morning, exhaustion had settled into my bones, compounding the pain of my physical injuries. The nurse who brought breakfast noticed immediately. "Rough night?" she asked, adjusting my bed to a sitting position. "Just nerves," I admitted. "Important meeting today." She checked my chart, then my vital signs. "Your blood pressure's up. You sure you're up for visitors? Dr. Patel would understand if you needed to postpone." I shook my head. "This can't wait." After she left, I texted Mia. "Meeting Dad at 10. Could use moral support after if you're free." Her response was immediate. "Already planned to come by at 11. Want me to bring reinforcements?" "Coffee, not an actual army, though I could probably round up some med students if needed." I smiled despite my anxiety. Coffee would be great. Save the med student army for another day. At 9:30, I asked the nurse for help, freshening up and changing into actual clothes. A simple t-shirt and loose sweatpants Mia had brought from my apartment. A small but significant upgrade from hospital gowns. By 9:45, I was sitting in the chair by the window rather than the bed. A deliberate choice to appear stronger, more composed. At 9:58, my phone buzzed with a text from my father. "In the parking lot. Be up in a few minutes." I took a deep breath, centering myself. On the small rolling table beside me, I'd arranged printed copies of the most damning documents Blake had provided. Bank statements showing transfers from family accounts to Diana's hidden offshore holdings, property records for the Florida condo, emails between Diana and financial advisors discussing discrete asset reallocation. At precisely 10:05, there was a knock at my door. "Come in," I called, my voice steadier than I felt. The door opened to reveal not just my father, but Diana as well. My heart sank even as anger flared. One simple request: come alone, and he couldn't even honor that. "I asked you to come alone," I said, not bothering to hide my disappointment. My father looked uncomfortable, glancing between Diana and me. "Alex, I thought it would be better if we discussed this as a family. Diana has some concerns about your emotional state after the accident." "Oh, I bet she does," I interrupted, my temper finally breaking through. "I bet she has all kinds of concerns about what I might say to you." Diana stepped forward, the picture of a concerned stepmother in her elegant cashmere sweater and perfectly styled hair. "Alex, sweetheart, we're all worried about you. The doctors mentioned potential emotional instability following traumatic brain injuries." "Stop," I held up a hand. "Just stop. My brain is fine. My memory is intact. And I remember exactly what you said to me in this room 4 days ago when you thought I was too weak to fight back." My father looked confused. "What is she talking about, Diana?" Before Diana could respond, I reached for the documents on the table. "I have something to show you, Dad. Something about where Mom's money actually went, and something else about where our family's money has been going for years." Diana moved with surprising speed, stepping forward to place her hand on the documents. "Thomas, Alex is clearly confused. The doctors warned us about this. Paranoia, confabulation. It's common with head injuries." My father hesitated, uncertainty written across his face. Maybe we should wait until you're feeling better, Alex. We can discuss the trust fund situation after you're discharged. There is no trust fund situation, Diana cut in smoothly. There was a perfectly legal reallocation of family resources that Thomas approved. Alex is just having trouble accepting it. I stared at my father, willing him to see through Diana's manipulations just this once. Dad, please. Just look at what I have. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. He seemed about to agree when Diana placed a hand on his arm. Thomas, I think we should consult with Dr. Patel first. If Alex is experiencing post-concussion syndrome, getting her agitated could be harmful. It was a masterful move, using concern for my health as a shield against the truth. I watched my father's expression shift from uncertainty to resignation. Diana's right, he said softly. We should talk to your doctor first. I don't want to do anything that might set back your recovery. Desperation surged through me. She's manipulating you. She's been doing it for years and you just keep letting her. This is exactly what I was concerned about, Diana said, her voice the perfect blend of sadness and concern. The emotional outbursts, the paranoia. My father stepped closer, his face painted. Alex, please. We just want what's best for you. No, I said, my voice breaking. She wants what's best for her. And you're too blind to see it. A deep weariness settled over my father's features. I think we should go. You need rest, not this. As they turned to leave, I made one last attempt. Blake knows, I said, the words cutting through the tension. He found the hidden accounts, the property in Florida. He knows what she's been doing, and he's the one who gave me these documents. Diana froze, her composure slipping for the first time. What? My father looked between us, confusion evident. What hidden accounts? What property? I seized the moment of uncertainty. The offshore accounts Diana's been feeding with money she claimed was for Blake's education. The condo in Boca Raton she purchased solely in her name 3 years ago. Ask her, Dad. Ask her where the money really went. Diana recovered quickly, her expression hardening. More delusions. Thomas, we need to go. Now. But my father remained rooted in place, studying his wife's face. Diana? What is Alex talking about? Nothing, Diana snapped, then immediately softened, her tone. Nothing real, Thomas. Alex is confused, mixing up bits of conversations, creating connections that don't exist. Then you won't mind if I look at these documents, my father said, taking a step toward the table where the papers lay. Diana moved to block him. This is ridiculous. We came here out of concern for Alex, not to indulge paranoid fantasies. It was the wrong move. My father's expression changed, suspicion finally breaking through years of willful blindness. If there's nothing to the accusations, then there's no harm in looking. For a moment, the room was silent, a triangle of tension between the three of us. Then Diana played her final card. Fine, she said, her voice suddenly cold. Look at whatever fabricated evidence Alex has concocted. But while you're at it, perhaps you should also know that your precious daughter has been planning legal action against us. She's been working with Caroline's attorney to build a case for fraud. My father's gaze snapped to me. Is this true? I met his eyes steadily. Yes, because what Diana did was fraud. She forged my signature, Dad. She stole my inheritance while I was unconscious in the ICU. And now she's threatening to drag our family name through a public legal battle, Diana added, her voice trembling with what seemed like genuine emotion, after everything we've done for her. My father looked stricken, torn between accusations from both sides. Alex? Fraud charges? Without even talking to me first? I tried, I said quietly. I gave you a chance to fix this when you visited earlier. This week. But you went straight to Diana, just like you always do. He had no response to that, the truth of it hanging in the air between us. Diana pressed her advantage. Thomas, we should go. We can discuss this at home as a family, without Alex's hostility. My father stood frozen, indecision written across his face. In that moment, I saw him as he truly was. Not the strong, decisive man of my childhood, but someone who had gradually surrendered his autonomy, his judgment, even his relationship with his child, all to maintain the illusion of domestic harmony with Diana. "Dad," I said softly, "please, just look at the documents." He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with apparent resolution. "I need to think. I'll call you later, Alex." So with that, he turned and walked out, leaving Diana and me alone. She stared at me, her mask of concerned stepmother completely gone. In its place was cold fury, calculation, and something that looked almost like respect. "You've gotten smarter," she said quietly. "Using Blake against me, I didn't see that coming." "Blake made his own choice," I replied. "Once he saw who you really are?" She laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Oh, Alex, you still don't understand, do you? Blake will always be my son. One conversation, one moment of doubt, that doesn't erase 20 years of loyalty." "We'll see," I said, holding her gaze. Diana moved toward the door, then paused. "Your father will never choose you over me. He never has, and he never will. Remember that before you push this any further." After she left, I slumped in the chair, exhaustion washing over me. The confrontation had gone nothing like I'd planned. Instead of presenting evidence to my father alone, I'd ended up in a three-way standoff where Diana had managed, yet again, to control the narrative. I reached for my phone to text Mia, then hesitated. What was there to say? That my father had once again failed to stand up for me? That Diana had outmaneuvered me yet again? Before I could decide, my phone rang. Blake. "Hey," he said, his voice tense. "Mom just called, completely losing it. What happened?" I gave him a brief summary of the confrontation, including Diana's confidence that he would remain loyal to her despite everything. Blake was quiet for a moment, then said, "She's already trying to spin this. Texted me that you're fabricating evidence because of your head injury." "And what do you think?" I asked carefully. "I think the bank statements and property records I found in her desk aren't fabrications," he replied firmly. "I think she's panicking because she knows you have real proof." Relief flooded through me. Despite Diana's certainty, Blake wasn't falling back into her manipulation. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "Wait at campus until this cools down," he said. "I have classes all afternoon anyway. But Alex, be careful. I've never heard Mom this rattled before." After we hung up, I barely had time to process the conversation before Mia arrived, carrying the promised coffee and a look of determination. "Okay, what happened?" she demanded, setting the coffee down and taking in my expression. "You look like you've been through hell." I recounted the confrontation in detail, watching Mia's expression shift from concern to outrage to grim satisfaction as I described Diana's momentary loss of composure. "So she's rattled," Mia concluded. "Good. Rattled people make mistakes." "Maybe," I agreed. But my father still left with her. He still couldn't bring himself to stand up to her, even with the promise of evidence right in front of him. Mia's expression softened. "Alex, your dad's been under Diana's influence for 8 years. That kind of manipulation doesn't break in a single moment." "Then what was the point?" I asked, frustration bubbling up. "What was the point of any of this if he's never going to see her for what she is?" "The point," Mia said firmly, "is that you're fighting back. The point is that Diana no longer gets to operate unchallenged. And the point is that you now have allies, me, Eleanor, even Blake." She was right, of course, even if my father couldn't. break free from Diana's influence. Even if the trust fund was truly gone, taking a stand mattered. After years of quiet acquiescence, of swallowing Diana's subtle cruelties and manipulations, I was finally saying, no more. My phone chimed with a text from Eleanor. How did the meeting go? Rather than trying to summarize via text, I called her, putting the phone on speaker so Mia could participate. Eleanor listened intently as I recounted the confrontation. This is actually promising, she said when I finished. Diana's visible agitation at the mention of the offshore accounts suggests genuine vulnerability. And the fact that Thomas hesitated at all is significant, given his pattern of automatic support for Diana. What now? I asked. The Friday deadline is tomorrow, but after today's disaster, we proceed exactly as planned, Eleanor replied firmly. Diana believes she's won this round, which may lead to overconfidence. Meanwhile, we have Blake's evidence, which she clearly didn't expect. Dad said he'd call later, I added, though without much hope. But I'm not holding my breath. Don't discount Thomas yet, Eleanor advised. Sometimes seeing a spouse in an unguarded moment of anger can be more revealing than any evidence we could present. So after the call ended, Mia helped me back to bed, my energy finally giving out after the morning's emotional confrontation. She stayed through lunch, then reluctantly left for a Zoom meeting with her medical school advisor. I'll be back tomorrow morning to help with discharge preparations, she promised. Try to rest, okay? Tomorrow's another battle. Alone again, I dozed fitfully, awakening to late afternoon shadows stretching across my room. My phone showed 3 missed calls, all from my father, no voicemails. As I debated returning his calls, a nurse entered with medication and news. Your discharge is all set for tomorrow at 2 p.m., she informed me. And you have another visitor, if you're feeling up to it. A Ms. Blackwood? Eleanor. I hadn't expected her to visit in person. Yes, please send her in, I said, quickly running a hand through my hair in a futile attempt to look more put together. Eleanor Blackwood entered moments later, every inch the polished attorney in her tailored suit and practical heels. At 62, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms and boardrooms, advocating for clients through life's most difficult moments. Alex, she greeted me warmly. I hope I'm not intruding, but after our call, I felt this conversation would be better in person. Of course not, I gestured to the visitor's chair. It's good to see you. Eleanor sat, placing her leather portfolio on her lap. I've been reviewing all the documentation, including what Blake provided. The case against Diana is solid. Forgery, fraud, possible tax evasion with the offshore accounts. I nodded, waiting for her to continue. But, she added, her expression growing more serious, pursuing criminal charges would inevitably impact your father as well. As her husband, with joint finances and his signature on some of the trust fund documents, he could face accessory charges at minimum. The implication was clear. Moving forward meant potentially destroying what remained of my relationship with my father, maybe even contributing to criminal charges against him. I know, I said quietly. I've been thinking about that all day. Eleanor studied me carefully. This is where the law meets family dynamics, Alex. Legally, we're in a strong position, but you need to be certain about what outcome you're seeking here. I want my inheritance back, I said immediately. The money my mother left for me. But beyond that, I trailed off, uncertain. Beyond that, what do you want for your relationship with your father? Eleanor prompted gently. And what consequences do you want Diana to face? It was the question I'd been avoiding. Did I want Diana punished? Absolutely. Did I want my father to finally see her for who she truly was? Without question. But did I want him to potentially face legal consequences for his willful blindness? That was harder to answer. I don't know, I admitted. I keep hoping there's some way to make him see the truth without destroying him in the process. Eleanor nodded understandingly. There may be, which is why I've prepared 2 sets of documents. She opened her portfolio and removed several papers. The first is a formal demand letter for the return of the trust fund with a deadline of 5 p.m. tomorrow, slightly extended from your original Friday morning deadline. If the funds are returned in full, we agree not to pursue criminal charges related to the trust fund matter. And the second? I asked. The second, Eleanor said, removing another set of documents, is a more comprehensive approach. It addresses not only the trust fund, but also demands full disclosure of all assets held by Diana individually or jointly, including the offshore accounts and properties. It essentially forces everything into the open. I considered the options. The first was cleaner, more focused on my immediate goal of recovering my inheritance. The second was broader, potentially more destructive, but also more likely to force a complete reckoning with Diana's years of financial manipulation. What would you advise? I asked, genuinely uncertain. Eleanor's expression remained neutral. As your attorney, I'd say the first option is more likely to achieve your stated goal of recovering the inheritance with minimal additional family trauma. The second option might be more satisfying emotionally, but carries greater risk of collateral damage. She was right. As much as part of me wanted Diana exposed completely, wanted my father to face the full extent of her deception, the primary goal had always been recovering what was rightfully mine. Let's go with the first option, I decided. For now. If they don't comply, we can always escalate. Eleanor nodded approvingly. A measured approach. I'll have my assistant deliver the demand letter to your father's office and home address tonight, ensuring receipt. As she prepared to leave, Eleanor paused. One more thing, Alex. Your mother would be proud of how you're handling this. Standing your ground while remaining strategic. That was very much Caroline's approach. The comparison to my mother brought unexpected tears to my eyes. Thank you, I managed. That means a lot. After Eleanor left, I found myself emotionally drained but somehow lighter, as if having a clear next step had lifted some of the burden. The path forward wasn't perfect, but it was defined, concrete. My phone buzzed again. My father called for the 4th time. This time I answered. Alex, he said immediately, his voice strained. We need to talk. Can I come back to the hospital? When? I asked, not committing yet. Now. Alone, I promise. I hesitated, then agreed. Fine. I'm being discharged tomorrow afternoon, so this is your last chance to talk at the hospital. I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, ending the call before I could respond. True to his word, exactly 20 minutes later, my father arrived alone, looking haggard and older than he had that morning. He carried a manila envelope, which he placed carefully on the rolling table before sitting. I've spent the day reviewing financial records, he began without preamble. After I left this morning, I went to the bank, then to our financial advisor, then to our accountant. I wanted to see for myself if what you suggested about hidden accounts could possibly be true. My heart raced. Had he actually investigated independently rather than simply accepting Diana's denials? And? I prompted. He opened the envelope, removing several documents. And I found these. Withdrawal authorizations I supposedly signed for. Transfers to accounts I've never heard of. Investment documents for property in Florida with my name forged as co-owner, even though I've never seen the property. He looked up, his eyes hollow. You were right, Alex. Diana has been hiding money, forging my signature, building some kind of separate financial life I knew nothing about. Relief and vindication washed through me. And the trust fund? My inheritance? My father's expression crumbled. That's more complicated. The money was transferred just as Diana said, but not to Blake's accounts, at least not all of it. Some went to these other accounts I never knew existed. He spread the documents on the table, pointing to transaction records. Your trust fund was drained in 3 separate transfers. One portion went to Blake's tuition account. That matches what Diana told me was happening. But these other 2 transfers, he indicated larger sums, went to numbered accounts that don't match any of our family holdings. I studied the papers, recognizing the same account numbers that had appeared in Blake's documents. Did you confront her? I asked quietly. My father nodded, looking suddenly much older than his 53 years. She denied everything at first, said the documents must be fake, that Blake was confused, that you were manipulating everyone against her. But when I showed her these, he gestured to the bank records he'd obtained independently. She changed. Tactics. Said she was protecting our future, creating a safety net in case my business failed. He ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair. 8 years, Alex. 8 years of marriage, and I never knew who she really was. The raw pain in his voice stirred unexpected sympathy. Whatever his failings as a father in recent years, Thomas Mitchell was now facing the collapse of his marriage, the betrayal of his trust, the realization that the woman he'd chosen to rebuild his life with had been systematically deceiving him. "I'm sorry, Dad," I said, meaning it despite everything. He looked up, surprise evident in his reddened eyes. "You're sorry? After how I've failed you? After I let Diana push you out of your own home, your own family? After I didn't believe you? This morning?" "I'm sorry you're hurting," I clarified. "That doesn't erase everything that's happened, but I don't take pleasure in seeing you in pain." He nodded, accepting this qualified sympathy. "I've contacted the bank about reversing the transfers from your trust fund. It's complicated because of the time that's passed, but they're working on it. I've also frozen all our joint accounts and Diana's access to my business accounts." This was more decisive action than I'd seen from my father in years. "What happens now? With you and Diana?" "I don't know," he admitted. "She's staying at a hotel tonight. I needed space to think, to figure out who I've been these past 8 years and who I want to be going forward." He met my gaze directly. "I do know one thing, though. I want to try to make things right with you, Alex, if you're willing to give me that chance." Before I could respond, my phone chimed with a text notification. I glanced down to see a message from an unknown number. "This is not over. You have no idea what's coming." Di showed the message to my father, whose face hardened. "She's threatening." "You now?" he asked, anger replacing sorrow. "Apparently," I replied, oddly calm in the face of Diana's rage, because for the first time in 8 years, I wasn't facing Diana's manipulations alone. I had Eleanor, Mia, Blake, and now it seemed my father finally seeing the truth. Diana thought this was her moment of victory, draining my inheritance, controlling my father, isolating me when I was at my most vulnerable. But she had miscalculated. Badly. Rather than securing her victory, her actions had set in motion her own undoing. The threat on my phone didn't frighten me. It confirmed what I already knew. Diana Reynolds Mitchell was finally losing control. And a cornered manipulator was dangerous, but also exposed, vulnerable, and ultimately defeatable. My father stared at the message, his expression hardening with each passing second. "I need to call my attorney," he said, pulling out his phone. "Wait." I placed my hand on his arm. "Before you do that, we should talk about what we actually want to happen here." He looked at me, confusion evident in his tired eyes. "What do you mean? Diana stole from you. From us. She needs to face consequences." "Yes. But what consequences?" I asked, thinking of Eleanor's measured approach. "Legal charges? Divorce? Financial? Restitution? All of the above?" "We need to be strategic, Dad, not reactive." My father sat back in his chair, seeming almost startled by my pragmatic response. For a moment, I saw a flicker of recognition in his face. Perhaps seeing my mother's analytical mind reflected in mine. "You sound like your mother," he said quietly, echoing my thoughts. She always wanted to think 3 steps ahead. I learned from the best, I replied with a small smile. My father glanced down at the threatening text again. Diana won't give up easily. She never does. No, I agreed. But for the first time, she's fighting against the truth, not just my word against hers. That changes everything. He nodded slowly, then pulled an additional document from the envelope. There's something else you should see. The original trust document your mother established. I took the paper with trembling fingers. It was the formal trust agreement, establishing the terms of my inheritance. As I scanned the document, a paragraph near the end caught my attention. In the event of unauthorized access or misappropriation of trust assets, I read aloud, the trustee shall have the power to pursue full legal remedies including interest penalties of 8% compounded annually on any misappropriated funds. My father pointed to the signature line at the bottom. Your mother added that clause specifically. The bank officer told me it's unusual in family trusts. Most include provisions for approved withdrawals, but not explicit penalties for misuse. She knew, I whispered, a fresh wave of gratitude for my mother washing over me. She suspected? Something like this might happen. Caroline was always perceptive, my father agreed. She saw things in people that the rest of us missed. His voice broke slightly. If I'd listened to her warnings about Diana back then. You weren't ready to hear them, I said gently. Grief makes us vulnerable. He looked up, eyes glistening. That's no excuse for what's happened since, for how I've let Diana come between us year after year. I didn't disagree, but neither did I push the point. My father's awakening to Diana's true nature was still fresh, fragile. Recriminations could come later, if at all. What matters now is what we do next, I said instead. Before my father could respond, his phone rang, Blake's name appearing on the screen. Should I take this? He asked, clearly uncertain about where Blake stood in all this. Yes, I answered, without hesitation. Whatever Diana's done, Blake's still your stepson, and he's the one who found the offshore account documents in the first place. My father answered, putting the call on speaker. Blake, I'm with Alex at the hospital. Dad, Blake's voice came through, tense and hurried. Mom's at the house. She's going through files, taking things from the safe. I just drove by and saw her car in the driveway. My father straightened, an alarm crossing his features. I changed the alarm code. How did she— The housekeeper probably let her in, Blake interrupted. Should I go in? Try to stop her? No, my father said firmly. Don't confront her. I'll call the police. Wait, I interjected, thinking quickly. If you call the police, this becomes public immediately. Is that what you want? My father hesitated, clearly torn between stopping Diana's activities and avoiding a public scandal. Blake, I said, leaning toward the phone. Can you tell what she's talking about? Financial documents, mostly, he replied. And I think, jewelry? She has your mom's jewelry box. I felt my blood run cold. My mother's jewelry, family heirlooms meant for me, had remained in my father's house after her death, stored in a special box my father had commissioned for her 40th birthday. Dad, I said urgently, Mom's sapphire pendant, the one from Grandma Mitchell. It's supposed to come to me. Understanding flashed across my father's face. The pendant was more than just jewelry. It was a Mitchell family heirloom, passed down through generations of women in our family. Blake, my father said decisively, don't confront her, but don't leave either. Let her know you're there. Your presence might slow her down until I can get there. Okay, Blake agreed. But hurry. After he hung up, my father stood, gathering the financial documents. I need to go. If Diana's taking what I think she is, she's planning to disappear with as many liquid assets as she can gather. Go, I urged. But Dad, be careful. Diana's desperate, and desperate people are unpredictable. He paused at the door, looking back at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. the protective, determined look of the father I remembered from childhood. "I'll handle Diana," he said with newfound resolve. "You focus on getting better. We'll talk tomorrow before your discharge." After he left, I immediately called Eleanor to update her on these dramatic developments. "This changes our approach slightly," she said, after I explained about Diana's activities at the house. "If she's removing assets, we need to act more aggressively to protect what remains." "What do you suggest?" I asked. "I'll file for an emergency temporary restraining order against Diana regarding all family assets," Eleanor replied. Professional, efficiency evident in her tone. "On your behalf as beneficiary of the trust she's already misappropriated. That will legally bar her from removing anything else while we sort through this mess." "Can you do that this late?" I glanced at the clock, noting it was after 6 p.m. "I have a judge who owes me a favor," Eleanor said with grim satisfaction. "Give me an hour." While waiting for developments, I texted Mia with a condensed update. Her response was immediate and colorful, involving several creative suggestions about what Diana could do with the stolen jewelry, none of which were anatomically possible. "On a serious note," she added, "want me to come keep you company?" Sounds like things are escalating. I considered her offer. Part of me craved moral support, but another part, the stronger part, recognized that this was a moment to stand. "Firm on my own, I'm okay," I replied. "Need some time to process, but definitely still on for discharge help tomorrow?" "Absolutely," she confirmed. "Sarah's already setting up the guest room. Get some rest if you can." Rest seemed impossible with so many developments unfolding, but my body had other ideas. The emotional exhaustion of the day's confrontations, combined with the physical demands of recovery, soon pulled me toward sleep despite my racing thoughts. I was awakened 2 hours later by a text from my father. Diana left. With some documents and jewelry, Blake helped me secure the rest. Police report filed for the missing items. We'll explain everything tomorrow. Rest now. Another text followed moments later. Found something else in the safe. Something your mother left for you that I didn't know about. Bringing it tomorrow. Curiosity burned, but exhaustion won out. Whatever my mother had left, whatever revelations tomorrow might bring, I needed strength to face them. For the first time since the accident, I slept deeply and dreamlessly, my body finally surrendering to the healing it desperately needed. Morning arrived with a sense of anticipation. My discharge was scheduled for 2 p.m., giving me several hours to prepare for whatever came next. During my final physical therapy session, the therapist commented on my improved energy and focus. "Whatever changed since yesterday, keep it up," she encouraged as she helped me practice navigating with crutches. "Your body responds better when your mind isn't fighting itself." She was right. The clarity that had come from finally confronting Diana, from my father beginning to see the truth, had lifted a weight I hadn't fully acknowledged was there. The road ahead remained challenging: recovery, legal battles, rebuilding trust with my father. But for the first time in years, I wasn't fighting these battles alone or in silence. As mid-morning approached, a nurse brought in discharge paperwork for me to begin reviewing. "Your friend called," she mentioned casually. "The medical student? Said she'll be here at noon to help with your things and drive you to where you're staying." I thanked her, then turned my attention to a new email from Eleanor with the subject line, "Restraining order granted." The body of the message was brief but satisfying. Judge Patterson signed the order at 8 a.m. Diana Reynolds Mitchell is legally barred from accessing, transferring, or removing any assets connected to the Mitchell family finances, trust funds, or properties pending full investigation. Your father has been served a copy as the primary property owner. Next steps to follow after your discharge. I was still absorbing this development when another text arrived from Blake. "Dad told me to let you know he'll be at the hospital by 11. He has news." The pieces were moving quickly now, the advantage shifting decidedly away from Diana. Whatever her threatening text had implied, whatever she had managed to take from the house, she was now operating with increasingly limited options. As I waited for my father's arrival, I found myself thinking about the future beyond this immediate crisis. My career at NextGen, my recovery process, my relationship with my father, all would need rebuilding in different ways. The trust fund mattered, yes, but it was only one piece of a larger picture. My mother had once told me, during the darkest days of her illness, "Money is just a tool, Alex. It can't buy happiness, but it can buy options, security, freedom to make choices based on what matters rather than what pays the bills." She had established the trust not just to provide financial support, but to ensure I would have the freedom to build a life on my own terms. Diana had tried to steal that freedom, to restrict my options, to force me into a position of vulnerability and dependence. In doing so, she had revealed not just her greed, but her fundamental misunderstanding of what wealth truly meant. To Diana, money was power. Power over others, power to control, power to present a certain image to the world. But my mother had understood a deeper truth. Real wealth wasn't measured in account balances or property holdings, but in the ability to live authentically, to make choices aligned with one's values, to build relationships based on genuine connection rather than manipulation. As I contemplated these distinctions, my phone chimed with a message from an unknown number. Diana again. "You think you've won? This isn't over. What's happening now is just the beginning. You have no idea what I'm capable of." Unlike her previous message, this one didn't prompt fear or anger. Instead, I felt an almost detached pity. Diana was lashing out from a position of rapidly diminishing power, her threats increasingly hollow as her support system crumbled around her. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Diana would learn soon enough that her reign of manipulation had come to an end, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the simple, irrefutable exposure of truth. Truth was the one weapon Diana had no defense against. Precisely at 11, my father arrived carrying both a leather briefcase and a small wooden box I immediately recognized, my mother's keepsake box, handcrafted by a local artisan she had admired. The sight of it brought an unexpected lump to my throat. "You look better," he said, setting both items carefully on the rolling table. "More like yourself." "Amazing what a good night's sleep can do," I replied, though we both knew my improved spirits had more to do with finally confronting Diana than with physical rest. My father sat, opening the briefcase first. "I've been up most of the night working with the bank and my attorney. We've managed to freeze the offshore accounts Blake identified, pending investigation. Some of the money Diana transferred is still there." "How much?" I asked, trying to temper my expectations. "About 60% of your trust fund," he replied, sliding over a spreadsheet detailing the account holdings. "The rest was either spent or moved to accounts we haven't identified yet." 60% was better than nothing. Much better, in fact, than I had dared hope after learning about Diana's systematic financial manipulations. "What about the items she took from the house?" I asked, thinking of my mother's jewelry. My father's expression darkened. "We filed a police report, and her car was stopped this morning attempting to leave the state. They found documents, some cash, and a few pieces of jewelry, but not your mother's sapphire pendant." Disappointment washed through me. That pendant had been in the Mitchell family for generations, a symbol of our heritage. "She must have hidden it somewhere else," my father continued, "or already passed it to someone for safekeeping. But we'll find it, Alex. I promise." I nodded, trying not to let the loss of the heirloom overshadow the larger victories. "And Diana herself?" "Released with a court date for the theft charges," he explained. "But that's just the beginning. My attorney is preparing divorce papers, And with the evidence of financial fraud and forgery, Diana won't be entitled to the usual division of assets. He hesitated, then added more quietly, Blake is devastated, of course. Even though he helped expose her actions, she's still his mother. He's staying with his college roommate for now, trying to process everything. I felt a surprising surge of empathy for Blake. Whatever his complicity in Diana's past manipulations, his decision to share what he'd discovered had helped turn the tide. And now he was caught between loyalty to his mother and recognition of her wrongdoing. An impossible position for anyone, let alone a 20-year-old still finding his way in the world. Maybe I could talk to him, I offered, when things settle down a bit. My father looked surprised, then grateful. I think he'd appreciate that. He asked about you this morning, wanted to know if you were still being discharged today. Our conversation was interrupted by Dr. Patel's arrival for a final check before discharge. He examined my healing incisions, tested my reflexes, and reviewed instructions for at-home care. You're making excellent progress, he concluded. But remember that full recovery will take time. Follow your physical therapy regimen. Take pain. Medication is needed. And don't push yourself too quickly. After he left, my father reached for the wooden box he'd brought. There's something else you should see, he said, his expression solemn. Something I didn't know about until last night. He opened the box, revealing several envelopes nestled among smaller keepsakes. A pressed flower, a smooth river stone, a tiny glass figurine I remembered from my mother's desk. Each envelope bore a date, written in my mother's distinctive handwriting. They were hidden in a compartment in the safe, my father explained. A section I didn't even know existed until I was removing everything last night after Diana left. With trembling fingers, I took the envelope my father offered, dated just 2 weeks before my mother's death. Inside was a letter, the paper still, crisp despite the years that had passed. My dearest Alex, it began. If you're reading this, it means 2 things. I am gone, and something has happened to make your father search the hidden compartment where I've placed these letters. I've written several, addressing different possibilities I can foresee, though perhaps the one you're reading now addresses circumstances I couldn't imagine. I won't pretend to know exactly what challenges you're facing, but I suspect it involves the trust fund I've established for you. Your father is a good man, the best I've known, but his kindness can sometimes blind him to the manipulation of others. If Diana, or whoever may have taken my place in your father's life, has attempted to access your inheritance, remember this. The visible trust is only part of what I've arranged for your future. I looked up at my father, who nodded encouragingly for me to continue. The main trust fund, the one Thomas administers until your 25th birthday, contains approximately 1/3 of my inheritance from my parents. The remainder is held in a separate trust with Wells Fargo Private Bank, known only to my attorney, Eleanor Blackwood. This secondary trust becomes accessible to you upon either your 25th birthday or in case of verified interference with the primary trust, whichever comes first. Eleanor has full documentation and will assist you in accessing these funds when appropriate. The account number is encoded in the birthstone sequence of the family pendant: sapphire for September, 9th, ruby for July, 7, emerald for May, 5, and so on. Eleanor knows the full sequence. This isn't about money, Alex. It's about ensuring your independence, your ability to build a life on your own terms without vulnerability to those who might see you as an obstacle rather than family. Use these resources wisely, not as a substitute for your own efforts, but as a foundation upon which to build. Remember who you are, not just my daughter, but your own person, with strength and perception that will guide you through whatever storms may come. I am proud of the woman you are becoming, and I love you beyond the bounds of time or distance. Always, Mom, tears streamed freely down my face as I finished reading. Once again, my mother had seen further, planned more carefully, protected me more thoroughly than I could have imagined. While Diana thought she had stripped me of financial security, a greater resource had been waiting, silent and secure, until needed. I had no idea, my father said softly, about any of it. The second trust, the coded sequence in the pendant, the hidden compartment. Caroline never told me. I understood why. My mother hadn't distrusted my father exactly, but she had recognized his tendency to see the best in people, to be swayed by emotional appeals, to avoid conflict whenever possible. She had created a safety net that bypassed his potential vulnerabilities. There are more letters, my father continued, gesturing to the remaining envelopes. Each date for specific birthdays or occasions: your wedding day, the birth of your first child, your 30th birthday. Caroline thought of everything. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling my mother's presence more vividly than I had in years. She hadn't been able to stay with me through the challenges of early adulthood, but she had done everything in her power to guide me nonetheless. "Thank you for finding these," I said, carefully returning the letter to its envelope. "It means everything." My father nodded, his own eyes glistening. "I should have looked harder years ago. Should have made sure you had all your mother's keepsakes, not just the ones Diana deemed appropriate to display." This acknowledgement of Diana's systematic erasure of my mother from our home life was something I'd never expected to hear from him. For years, Diana had relegated photos of my mother to albums rather than frames, had redecorated to remove her touches from each room, had subtly discouraged conversation about her under the guise of moving forward. And my father had allowed, it perhaps even welcomed it as an escape from grief. "We can't change the past," I said finally, "but we can do better going forward." Before he could respond, Mia arrived with her characteristically perfect timing and practical energy. "Discharge party time," she announced, setting down a duffel bag filled with comfortable clothes and toiletries. "Chariot awaits whenever you're ready, princess." My father looked momentarily startled, then reached out to shake Mia's hand. "Thomas Mitchell. I don't think we've seen each other since Alex's college graduation." That would be because Diana made sure Alex was only invited to family events when I couldn't attend, Mia replied with blunt honesty. "But water under the bridge, right? Moving forward and all that?" I suppressed a smile at my father's flustered expression. Mia had never been one to observe social niceties at the expense of truth. "Mia's cousin is letting me stay with them during initial recovery," I explained. "First floor guest room, accessible bathroom, much better than my walk-up apartment. My—" Father nodded, clearly processing this information. "I had assumed, well, I thought you might come home, to the house." The offer surprised me. After 8 years of feeling increasingly unwelcome in my childhood home, the suggestion that I might return there during recovery hadn't even occurred to me. "That's kind," I said carefully, "but I think this arrangement is better for everyone right now. Neutral territory while we all figure out next steps." He accepted this with a nod, though I could see a flash of disappointment cross his features. "Of course, but the offer stands, if you change your mind." As Mia helped me gather my belongings and change into street clothes, my father stepped out to give us privacy, returning just as a nurse arrived with a wheelchair for my official discharge. "Hospital policy," she explained cheerfully. "Everyone gets the royal wheelchair treatment on their way out, no exceptions." The journey from my room to Mia's waiting car passed in a blur of paperwork, well wishes from hospital staff, and final instructions. My father walked alongside, carrying my mother's keepsake box and a small bag of personal items, looking somewhat lost amid the efficiency of the discharge process. At Mia's car, an awkward moment stretched between us. After the emotional revelations of the morning, returning to our previously distant relationship seemed impossible, yet we hadn't yet established what would replace it. "I'll call you tomorrow," my father said finally, carefully transferring my belongings to Mia's trunk. And I'll keep you updated on all developments with Diana and the accounts. Thank you, I replied, then added impulsively, maybe you could come for dinner at Sarah's next week, once I'm settled? His face brightened visibly. I'd like that very much. As Mia drove us away from the hospital, I watched my father in the key side mirror, standing straight-backed and solitary in the circular driveway. For the first time in years, I saw him clearly, not as the infallible parent of my childhood, nor as the disappointing enabler of Diana's schemes, but as a flawed, complex human being who had made serious mistakes but was trying, however imperfectly, to make amends. So, Mia said, interrupting my thoughts as we merged onto the highway. Scale of 1 to 10, how weird was that father-daughter reunion scene back there? I laughed, grateful for her ability to cut through emotional tension. Solid 8 on the weird scale, but also necessary. Progress isn't always comfortable, she agreed, then changed topics with her usual practicality. Sarah's stocked the guest room with everything from compression socks to Netflix access. Operation Recovery is fully prepared. The drive to Sarah's comfortable suburban home took about 30 minutes, during which I filled Mia in on the morning's discoveries, the recovered funds, the police report about Diana's attempted departure, and most importantly, my mother's hidden letters and the revelation about the second trust. Your mom was a certified badass, Mia declared as we pulled into Sarah's driveway. Secret trusts, coded messages in jewelry. It's like something out of a spy novel. She just wanted to make sure I'd be okay, I said, feeling a renewed wave of gratitude for my mother's foresight. And you will be, Mia assured me, parking and coming around to help me navigate from car to door. Better than okay. Sarah, Mia's cousin and a high school art teacher I'd met a few times over the years, greeted us warmly and showed me to the guest room she'd prepared. True to Mia's description, every detail had been considered, from the arrangement of furniture to accommodate crutches to the basket of snacks and medications on the bedside table. Make yourself at home, Sarah insisted. Mi casa and all that. I'm mostly at school during the day, but I've left my number and some local delivery options on the fridge. By evening, I was settled into what would be my home for the next few weeks, comfortable, secure, and surrounded by genuine care rather than Diana's performative concern. After dinner, as Mia and Sarah cleared dishes despite my offers to help, my phone rang with an unknown number. It was Blake. Hey, he said, his voice subdued. Dad said you were discharged today. How's the new place? Good, I replied, surprised, but pleased by his call. How are you holding up? A heavy sigh came through the line. Been better. Mom keeps calling, alternating between sobbing apologies and thinly veiled threats. It's a lot. I can imagine, I said, feeling genuine sympathy despite everything. Have you decided what you're going to do? Not really, he admitted. I can't pretend I didn't see those documents, can't unhear her admission when confronted. But she's still my mom, you know? I do know, I said quietly. And Blake? I don't expect you to cut her off or take sides. Family is complicated. There was a pause, then Blake said, That's not what I expected you to say. What did you expect? I don't know. Gloating? Demands. That I testify against her? You'd have every right. I considered this. Maybe, but that wouldn't help either of us move forward. You made your choice when you shared those documents, and I'm grateful. What happens next between you and Diana is your business. After we hung up, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in the week since my accident. The car crash that had seemed like the worst kind of bad luck had ultimately catalyzed a long overdue reckoning. Diana's opportunistic grab for my inheritance had backfired spectacularly, exposing not just her theft, but years of financial manipulation and deception. My phone chimed with a text from Eleanor. Just heard from Thomas's attorney. Diana has agreed to return all remaining trust fund money in exchange for dropped charges. Your father is inclined to accept on your behalf. Thoughts? I considered the offer. Part of me wanted Diana to face full legal consequences for her actions, the forgery, the theft, the years of manipulation. But another part recognized the practical benefits of a clean resolution. A prolonged legal battle would drain emotional energy better spent on healing and rebuilding. If all remaining funds are returned, including documented offshore accounts, and she signs a legal admission of wrongdoing that can be used if she ever tries anything similar in the future, I'm willing to accept, I replied after careful consideration. Eleanor's response was swift. Good decision. I'll draft the agreement. Also, regarding your mother's second trust, I've begun the verification process. Preliminary balance shows approximately $2.4 million untouched since Caroline established it. The figure momentarily took my breath away. Even after Diana's theft, even after losing a significant portion of the original trust, I would ultimately have more financial security than I'd realized. The second trust alone would provide a foundation for whatever future I chose to build. But the money itself, while significant, wasn't the most valuable inheritance my mother had left me. Her foresight, her protective planning, her absolute determination to secure my future even after her death, these were the true gifts. Along with the wisdom in her letters, the values she'd instilled during our too brief time together, and the strength she'd modeled even in her final days. 3 weeks after my discharge from the hospital, life had established a new rhythm. Physical therapy 3 times weekly was gradually rebuilding my strength and mobility. Remote work arrangements with NextGen allowed me to contribute to projects while continuing recovery. And weekly dinners with my father were slowly, tentatively, rebuilding our relationship. Diana, true to Eleanor's prediction, had ultimately chosen self-preservation over principle. With criminal charges hanging over her head and divorce proceedings revealing the full extent of her financial manipulations, she had signed the agreement returning the remaining trust fund money and admitting to forgery and fraud. In exchange, my father and I had declined to pursue criminal prosecution, allowing her to leave the state with a modest settlement that represented only her legitimate contributions to the marriage. Blake had chosen a middle path, maintaining limited contact with Diana while establishing clearer boundaries than had ever existed in their relationship. He'd transferred to a state university that better matched his academic interests, freeing himself from the expensive private college Diana had insisted upon, partly as justification for accessing my trust fund. Most surprising to everyone, perhaps. Even to ourselves, Blake and I had developed something resembling actual friendship. The shared experience of Diana's manipulation, despite our different positions within it, had created an unexpected bond. We weren't exactly family in the traditional sense, but we were something, allies perhaps, or survivors of the same emotional storm. On a crisp autumn afternoon, almost exactly 2 months after the accident, my father arrived for our now regular dinner with something clutched carefully in his hand. I found it, he said without preamble, opening his palm to reveal my mother's sapphire pendant. In a safety deposit box Diana had rented under her maiden name. The police recovered it during their investigation. I took the pendant with trembling hands, the blue stone catching the light just as I remembered from childhood, when my mother would wear it on special occasions. The chain was fashioned in an intricate pattern that, I now knew, contained a coded sequence of numbers, the key to the second trust she had established for my protection. "It belongs with you," my father said softly. It always did. As I fastened the chain around my neck, feeling the familiar weight of the pendant settle against my skin, I thought about cycles broken and legacies continued. Diana had attempted to erase my mother's influence, to appropriate resources meant for my future, to position herself and Blake as the real family, while relegating me to the margins. She had failed, not just because of my resistance or my father's belated awakening, but because she had fundamentally misunderstood what family truly meant. Family wasn't defined by legal documents or financial control or careful image management. It was built on honesty, mutual support, and genuine care. Qualities Diana had imitated but never embodied. Looking down at the sapphire pendant, I silently thanked my mother for her final gifts. Not just financial security, but the wisdom to recognize authentic connection, the courage to stand firm in the face of manipulation, and the capacity to rebuild what had been damaged without being consumed by bitterness. As my father and I walked to the restaurant for dinner, my first outing without crutches since the accident, I realized that Diana had been wrong about one final thing. When she had stood in my hospital room and declared, "You're just extra," she had failed to recognize that I was, in fact, essential to my mother's legacy, to my father's redemption, and to my own future, unbounded by her attempts to constrain it. My inheritance had never really been about money at all. It was about claiming the strength, resilience, and clarity of purpose that were my birthright, qualities no one, not even Diana, at her most manipulative, could ever truly take away. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.